Right, well, we'll get going now. I think people will slowly join still. Firstly, great to see such a good turnout for the first QAstion Time Lunch and Learn series. For those of you that don't know, my name's Christy. I'm a QA and test consultant for Expertise Recruitment, and I place testers with my awesome clients across Manchester and Leeds. As a bit of background, the idea behind the Lunch and Learn series is to get a range of testers to cover a range of topics to help the community with their work. So this week we've got Danny, who'll be covering improving test processes with TMMi. Next week we have the awesome agile and test coach Duncan Nisbet, who'll be talking about his approach to self-development while out of work, which I think is a really relevant topic right now for so many people, who find themselves out of work or away from work for whatever reason. So do keep your eyes peeled as well for more details on that in the next few days. But as I hear, some people are beginning to get some Zoom fatigue, I suppose, as it is, on the back of lots of online meetings. The idea is to keep these sessions quite short and sweet. So every Wednesday, there'll just be one speaker covering one topic for 30 minutes, and you'll then have a chance to ask any questions you might have on the back of the talk. Feel free to utilize the messaging function on Zoom, so you can put forward your questions to Danny whilst they're fresh in your mind, and we'll run through these at the end. Also, do feel free to speak up and ask him yourself at the end of the talk. I would love to see, these meetings spark some conversation and more knowledge sharing between people afterwards. So don't shy away from, actually speaking up at the end of the talk. Whilst Danny is talking, it'd be, if you could all go on mute just so there's no background noise or interference, that'd be great. And also, if you'd like to keep your camera on, obviously, if you're fully clothed and feel comfortable doing so, it's always nice seeing lots of smiling faces, and it can often help put the speakers at ease as well. So without further ado anyway, I'll hand over to Danny, who I'm sure will give you all his own introduction, and I hope you all really enjoy the session.
Hi guys, yeah, so thank you very much everybody for joining, really appreciate it. I know we're all busy and as Christy said, probably all sick of video calls, but I appreciate you joining. So I'll just share my screen, then we'll get started straight away. So just bear with me 1 second. Where is it? There it is. Okay, can we all see my screen? Please say if you can't see it. You can. Awesome. Okay, great. Right, so so as Christy said, this talk's going to be about continuous improvement with test maturity model integration, or TMMi. Most people I talk to about this, I've talked about this quite a lot. Most people don't know what this actually is. So hopefully this talk will really help you to understand what TMMi is as an actual model and an actual thing and how you might use it. And then also kind of what sort of use you can get from it to help improve your test processes. Okay, so it is quite a detailed and in-depth model, but it's easy to kind of pick bits out of it to deal with certain problem areas you might have, and we'll explain that as we go through. So it can be a very large undertaking and quite an involved process, but also it can be very easily used to help you figure out how to resolve certain small issues you might have with things like test environments, test data, that kind of thing. Okay, so hopefully it'll help to cover a lot of bases for you. All right, so just very quickly about me. So I'm Danny, I'm the product owner for the testing service at FDM Group. So FDM, we are a recruit, train and deploy organization. So we bring in graduates, we train them in a certain area of IT, and then we deploy them out to clients. So my role is to kind of work across all those areas. So I help to make sure we're bringing in candidates who have the right skill set, making sure the training we provide is up to date, is relevant and meets our clients' needs. And then once the guys are deployed, working with clients to make sure they are successful. Okay, I've been in testing for 10 years. I've worked across a number of different roles. So I've worked for Sky, I've worked for YBS, I've worked for the Cooperative Group, I've worked for Barclays, in a variety of different roles, ranging from test analyst to test automation lead to test manager to head of test. So pretty much every role in testing, I've done it at some point. And I've got a number of certifications. So ICQB, Certified Scrum Master, and the TMMi Professional certification as well, which I can mention at the end, because obviously it's relevant to what we're talking about today. Cool. So as a very quick kind of introduction, continuous improvement should be something that all organizations are looking to do. Okay, so we should be continuously looking at sort of the metrics and feedback that we're getting from our test teams and from our stakeholders about how our test process is working and how effective it is. We should be taking that feedback and then continuously looking to improve. Okay, now when looking at improvement, we should always be driven by some kind of framework or aspirational standard that we're looking to achieve. Yeah, we're not just improving for the sake of it and not just improving because we're being told to. There's got to be some sort of end goal that we want to achieve as to this is what we think as an organization a good test process looks like, and that's what we should be driving to achieve. Now, TMMi is really good because it can give you that objective framework. Yeah, so rather than having to define all that yourself, you can look at TMMi and go, right, that's what a test, that's what an effective test model and an effective test process looks like. So we can improve our processes to try and achieve those goals defined by TMMi. Okay, so again, as I've kind of said there, it's impossible to sort of get improvement and get something effective if you don't know where you're trying to go. Okay, so hopefully, again, through this talk, you can see how TMMi can help you with that. Okay, right, I've just listed here as well some very common test process issues that probably quite a lot of you have encountered before. And again, I'll refer back to this at the end to show kind of, again, how TMMi can help or how TMMi covers these sorts of elements. Okay, so again, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but test data is always a problem. How do we maintain it? How do we create it? How do we make sure it's valid and accurate? How do we make sure it's anonymous as well? You know, all sorts of issues with test data. I found on site that test data and test environments are probably the two biggest challenges that I face. I'd be interested to know what you guys think, but they're the two things I typically have the most problems with. Environments, again, similar kind of thing to data in terms of how do we maintain them? How do we make sure they're accurate and fit for purpose? How do we share them with other test teams? How do we make sure that you know, they're kept up to date? All those sorts of issues similar to test data. Skill shortages in terms of, do our team have the right skills to be able to do their role? And as our sort of technology improves and as our general processes improve in other areas, how can we make sure that testing's kept up to date? So again, our guys need to be trained. And again, I find a lot of the time that it's difficult to take people out of project work to give them training, you know, because they're being fully focused on delivery and fully focused on making sure they can, you know, achieve what the business wants. Well, how can we find the time to take the guys out and do that? And again, TMMi can work on that. Collateral, so your documentation, making sure that's, again, up to date and detailed and at the right level in terms of detail. Early iterative testing. So again, a lot of organizations are still very waterfall driven. So, you know, making sure we can get that testing in as early as we can to find defects early that are cheaper to fix. And understanding the value of testing is another key one, because again, especially at the moment, I found that, you know, in the current situation, a lot of organizations are sort of, if they've got a project budget issue, it tends to be testing that takes the hit because, you know, clients still believe that our developers can do the testing, or we can just accept the risk and not do as much testing. So, you know, again, it's really important to make sure that as a test collective, we're working on kind of making sure that, you know, we push the value and importance of testing. Okay, so again, I'll refer back to these at the end and show how TMMi can link to these. Okay, right, so in terms of what I'm going to cover, so I'll talk about what TMMi actually is. I'll talk about those quick wins that I mentioned, so, you know, how we can pick out elements of TMMi to improve certain areas that we might be having specific trouble with. And then I'll talk about full TMMi assessments as well, so say it can be a very involved and detailed process, and I'll talk about the general benefits as well. Okay. Cool. So what is it? So as I've alluded to already, it's a framework that we use to objectively measure the maturity of our organization's test process. Okay. So there are multiple levels to TMMi. So 1 is sort of the worst level of maturity, and then 5 is the best. And within those, there are what we call process areas. So the process areas are kind of the areas that we're going to look at to make sure we're effective in. Okay. We'll look at these in more detail in a second. But to give you an example, there's things like test policy and planning. There's things like test environments. There's things like test training solutions, you know. So again, those process areas kind of pick out small areas of the overall process that we will then look at, well, what makes this a good process? What measures need to be in place within the business to make sure we're doing this well and effectively? Okay. And again, we'll talk through what they are in more detail in a minute. The model's good in the fact that it recognizes that not all organizations work in the same way. So, you know, some organizations are waterfall still, some are agile, some have different cultures, etc. So it's specific enough to cover all the test activities you would need to have within those different types of methodology, but it's generic enough to cover all the different life cycles that we have available. So again, it's quite flexible in that sense. I've mentioned it's a stage model already, so we've got that 1 to 5. And also, you know, oh, I can't see the slide properly here, just bear with me a second. And as I said, each maturity level has a number of process areas. So let's kind of look at the different levels and what they mean. Okay, so there's 5 levels. There's level 1 through to level 5. Level 1's what you call initial, so that's the worst. So that's just basically, it's testing is very chaotic, it's undefined, and it's typically done by the development team. Okay, so there's no real kind of test team, there's no real governance or processes in place. So if you're in level 1, you're pretty scuppered basically, because you've not got a good test team in place. Level 2 is where you will find most organizations are. So that's where we've got a managed process that's clearly separated from development. So we've got clear management in place, we've got a clear test team, and we've got that separation from the development team. So we've got a test team who's creating its own tests, who's doing execution, who's managing the defects, who's working closely with the stakeholders, etc. Yeah. Level 3 is defined, so that's where we then get now testing more fully integrated into the software development lifecycle. Okay, so we're going to start getting more involved in the requirements definition of user story definition. We're going to start doing reviews. We're going to start getting much more involved at those early stages to bring that value that the test team can bring early on in the process. So finding defects early, understanding what needs to be tested early, getting things set up in terms of environments, in terms of data, and all that sort of stuff early on in the process. Level 4 is called measured, so that's where we've got a well-designed process and we measure it using quantitative objectives. Okay, so we're looking at much more in detail about the metrics that we cover. We're looking in a lot more detail about the actual product of, the actual quality of the product and how we measure that. So it's a much more kind of in-depth, more analytical approach. Okay, and then level 5 is optimization. So that's where now we're continuously looking to self-improve. So it's similar to level 4, but now we're using those metrics and that data that we gather, and we're looking at how we can continuously improve our process, iteratively. Okay. Right, then if we look at sort of the process areas now. So as I kind of said, we've got these 5 levels. Within each level, we've then got specific process areas. So these process areas are kind of individual areas within our process that we're going to look at. Well, how do we do this? How do we currently work within this sort of space? And what are sort of the measures and criteria that we would consider to identify if this process is effective or not? Okay, so if we look at level 2, so there's things in here, policy and strategy. So is there a test policy in place? What level of detail is that policy in? Does the business understand what that policy is? And same with the strategy as well. So, is it in place? How detailed is it? Is that, do the business understand that strategy and how they fit into it, etc. Yeah. Planning, all about, do we have test plans in place? What do they look like? Are they detailed? Do the stakeholders understand what they are, etc.? Monitoring and control. So how are we tracking the progress through the testing process in terms of, do we have sort of, again, metrics in place that can measure how effective we are at, our sort of test coverage and our the execution, and if there are issues that we identify through that process, what control measures can we put in place? So how can we make sure that we deal with those issues and mitigate any challenges that we face early on? Yeah. Design and execution. So how are we creating our tests? How are we actually kind of formatting those? Are they BDD? Are they in a more kind of standard test script format? What's the execution process? How are we scheduling testing? How are we communicating that to our stakeholders? How are we managing defects? All those kind of key things, again, that you would do during the execution process. And then environment. So how are we actually defining the requirements for our environment? How are we implementing it? Are we doing smoke testing? Again, all those key things to set up an environment very clearly. Okay, and again, I'll talk through an example and show you some examples of the specific criteria as we go through the talk. Okay, and this is just a general overview to give you the idea. Level 3 is then defined. So in terms of test organization, that's more about, okay, is there a separate centralized area, so like a testing center of excellence within the organization that is separate, that manages and controls testing? So it's a much more defined process because it's its own entity, and it's got its own kind of centralized resource pool and centralized knowledge hub that manages testing throughout the business. Is there a test training program in place? Put my teeth back in. Is there a test training program in place? So, you know, is there that, as we said earlier, that kind of skill set understanding to identify, well, what training needs do our testers have? What can we do to make sure that they can achieve those training needs? In terms of, if we identify there's maybe you know, we're going to start developing some new APIs that we've never done before. Do our testers understand what APIs are? Do they understand how to do API testing? If they don't, how can we make sure that they gain that knowledge and you know, in an effective way? Lifecycle and integration. So as we mentioned before, how does testing fit into development lifecycle, and how can we integrate it effectively to make sure we're doing reviews and make sure we're doing testing early and at each stage of the lifecycle? Non-functional testing, always important, you know, usability testing, performance testing, accessibility testing, you know, these kind of non-functional elements that are critical to the success of any you know, test process. And peer reviews. So again, throughout the whole process, making sure we're reviewing documentation, we're reviewing code in line, you know, with sort of the standards that we've set. Measured is then we look at test measurement. So that's primarily about metrics. We look at product quality evaluation. So are we going to put some criteria in place to identify what makes this application that we're testing of high quality? Yeah, so that again, we know what good looks like and we know how that fits into the testing process and how that fits into what we're trying to achieve overall as a team. And then advanced reviews, making sure we can go into more detail with the reviews we do. So again, the peer reviews might be kind of if you've done your ICTQB, you know, things like informal reviews and those kind of less sort of detailed reviews. And advanced reviews would be more, well, we're doing inspections, we're doing you know, technical reviews that are much more in depth and much more you know, formalized. And then level 5 optimization, that's around preventing defects before they occur, which again aligns with sort of reviews and that early testing that we've talked about already. Test process optimization, so again, looking at all those metrics and data and information that we're gathering and how can we improve. And quality control. So throughout the whole process, looking at kind of that QA process in terms of how can we make sure not just testing, but the whole delivery process generally is effective and is meeting the needs of the business. Okay, so that's sort of the model and the process areas that we can look at. If we now talk about the components, okay, so we've talked about 2 of them already. So we've talked about maturity level, the 1 to 5 and what they are. We've mentioned the process areas and how they fit in. Underneath the process areas, we've then got these required and expected components, okay? So required components, we have specific goals and we have generic goals, okay? So specific goals are now, we're driving into more detail about, well, how are we going to actually check that we are doing this particular process area effectively, okay? So going back to, again, test environment, the specific goals might be around, well, have we got a process in place for actually gathering the requirements for the test environment? Have we got a smoke testing process in place? Yeah, so again, it's that kind of, you measure the effectiveness by looking at the specific goals and saying, how good are we as an organization at meeting these goals? Yeah, so, you know, they're very detailed and they go into much more detail as well as, you know, you go through the model as we look at the other components that I'll talk about in a second. So the specific goals are a bit more high level in terms of what do we need to have in place to make sure that within this process area we are effective. Okay, then generic goals are more about, well, how do we make sure that this set of activities and processes that we've defined, how do we make sure that they're institutionalized across the business? Yeah, so again, we might have multiple teams working. We don't just want one team to be fantastic and really follow the processes we've defined whilst the others do their own thing. So again, generic goals consider, well, what things need to be in place to make sure that every team understands this is the process they need to follow. This is you know, what good looks like, and this is what they should be doing to make sure they are effective. Okay, so there's a very clear distinction between those 2. Yeah, so specific goals are what goals need to be met to make sure we're effective in this area. And generic goals are what goals do we need to have met to make sure that we are effective across our entire organization, all of our teams. Okay, then it drills down into more detail in terms of the specific practices and generic practices. So again, that's a further breakdown. So for each specific goal, you will further break down into specific practices about, right, so to meet that goal, here's the other more specific things we need to achieve. Yeah, so it's a very similar kind of thing. It's just in more detail. And again, I'll show you an example of those later so you can get an idea of what level of detail it's at. Okay, right, so that's generally the model. it's a lot more detailed than that, as you can imagine, but that's kind of a very quick stop overview. If we now talk about quick wins, okay, so as I alluded to at the start, TMMi can be very long and detailed, and there can be a high amount of effort involved to achieve the long-term benefits, which are very beneficial and, you know, should be considered. But it can be used to achieve very quick wins, okay? So what you can do is you can pick out a particular process area. So as I said, you might be really struggling from a test environment perspective. So, you know, your test environments might be poorly managed. There might be lots of issues that occur whilst you're doing your testing from the environments. Yeah. So you might say, well, okay, how can we improve this? What things do we need to be looking at to make sure that we have a good test environment process? Yeah. So you can use TMMi and say, right, we'll just pick out that particular process area. We'll look at the specific and generic goals and practices and see how good we are at doing these things. And if we're not very good, then how can we get to that place? Yeah. So it's a really good kind of starting point for helping you to, and then go to the business as well and say, here's the things we're not very good at based on this model. How can we now work towards improving these? Yeah. And a lot of this stuff you'll probably already know from your own experience, but it's just a good sort of checklist where you can check a list off and say, right, here's a number of things we need to look at. And it's also really good at, again, going back to the business saying, this isn't just me saying this. This is, you know, there's a model out there that's got all this detail on it that explains this is what we should be doing. Okay. So it works well from both those aspects in terms of it helps just give you a bit of validation in terms of, have I thought of everything? Oh, I didn't think of that before. Oh, right, great. Okay, let me consider that. And also that validation to the business of, look, there's models out there that explain, here's how we should be doing things. Let's maybe work to try and achieve that. Okay. And I'm not saying that, you know, everything on here will be relevant to your business and you should be doing, but again, it's just a good starting point where you can say, well, actually, that specific goal isn't relevant to us as a business, so we can exclude that one, but actually that one is, and I've not thought of it before. Great. Let's have a think about how we could implement that. Okay. So let's just talk through an example, right? So I've mentioned test environment a lot just because it's the one that I think is one of the most relevant, because it's, as I mentioned, one of the areas that I found the most challenges in when I've been on site. So let's just talk through the specific goals and practices here, okay, just to give you an idea, yeah? So the test environment process area has 3 specific goals, okay? There's develop test environment requirements, there is perform test environment implementation, and there is manage and control test environments, okay? So they're the 3 specific goals that we want to achieve within this process area, okay? Underneath that, as I've said, there are specific practices, okay? So for develop test environment requirements, it's gonna be things like, well, have we actually, you know, extracted and developed the test environment needs that we have? Have we developed those into more detail? And have we actually analyzed them to make sure that we can achieve them and to make sure that we've got sort of the knowledge and infrastructure in-house to be able to deliver it successfully? Okay. And then perform test environment implementation. So obviously implement it. Have we created some test data in that environment to A, test it with, and B, you know, that we can use going forward when we actually want to do this formalized testing? Have we got an intake procedure? So by intake procedure, that just means a smoke test. So have we defined a smoke test so that once we've created the environment or done an update to it, can we run a quick set of tests that say, yeah, this environment meets our needs and it's good to go? Okay. And obviously once we've defined that smoke test, we want to perform it as well. Manage and control test environments. So that's about, well, have we actually coordinated the availability and usage of the environment? Have we got a process for managing the data? Have we got a process for managing the actual environment itself in terms of updates, in terms of maintenance? And have we got a process for reporting and managing any incidents that might occur? Okay, so that just gives you an idea of sort of the general things that you can look at to help you, you know, understand where you are in terms of maturity with your test environments. Yeah, so as I said, it's that checklist where you can look at your current process and say, right, have we done these things? If not, why not? Is it relevant to us? Maybe it isn't. If it is, then is it something we should be looking to do? Okay. So the next slide just kind of says what I've just said, really, in terms of, you know, you can use it as a starting point. You can look at the specific practices. You can define further actions. There's also as well, just to go into even more detail, but I won't do that now. There's also sub-practices as well. So coming back here, for each specific practice, so to pick one out, for example, for report and manage test environment incidents, there's also sub-practices which further define, here's how you should be looking to report and manage your environment incidents. Yeah, so it does go into an awful lot of detail. Okay, and the model is freely available. So I'll put the link on there. If you just go to the TMMi.org website and you look for kind of their resources on there, the whole model is on there. It's about a 200-page document. So I'm not saying read all of that, but again, there might be certain things you can look at on there to start giving you those ideas and that checklist on, oh yeah, this is what we can be looking at to improve. Okay, so it's a really good resource, in my opinion. Okay, then just to quickly talk about full assessments now, because I realise we've probably only got about 5 minutes left. So just talk about full assessments. So there are a number of organisations out there who are accredited to do TMMi assessments. So they'll send in a team, they will complete a full assessment for you. So they will review your processes by doing interviews, by gathering data from your organisation. They will then kind of review that, and they will give you kind of an understanding of what maturity level you are at. So, they can analyze the data for you, and they can say, right, based on all this information that we've gathered, we are going to assign you test maturity level 2, and here's what you can improve to get to level 3. Okay, so again, you can, if you want to kind of understand at that really in-depth level, you can get that support from other organizations to do that for you. Okay, you can do it yourself as well. As I say, the whole model is available. So you can do your own basic assessments if you want to. If you kind of look at everything that's on there and you want to undertake that task, then that's great and that's fine. The information is there. Yeah, so it's not something that you have to go out to external providers. The information is freely available. It's just they've obviously got that knowledge and have done it multiple times before. Okay. Right, moving on to the next one. So just quickly to talk about the phases of a full assessment in case you ever wanted to look at it for yourself. So what you do initially is you do planning and preparation. So you think about all the activities that you need to complete before the assessment is performed. Okay, so that's things like, well, agree what are we trying to achieve by doing this assessment? What's the actual purpose of it? So are we looking to just understand generally what maturity level we're at, or are we looking at process improvement and how we can do that? Because that will help to then sort of look at the report you create at the end and the data that you analyze. Yeah, so that objective being defined is really important. And then other things as well might be that, looking to arrange interviews, decide what data you're going to gather, decide what artifacts you need access to, etc. Then you'll go out and collect the data. So the team you've defined will go out and they'll carry out the interviews with, a range of stakeholders. So that might not just be testers. So, obviously you'll need testers involved, your test managers, your test analysts, but also other stakeholders who are engaged with the test process. So, you might speak to development and see how the test team engages with development. You might speak to the project manager, etc. Just to gather all that information about this is how testing works in this organization. Yeah, and then also other information to support the interviews, as I said, like artifacts, or you might define some surveys or questionnaires, that the stakeholders might complete as well. Once you've done all that, you'll then analyze that data. So, you will look at, from that, what the strengths and weaknesses are of the process. You'll define your rating, and then you'll consider any other objectives as well. So again, if you have defined at the start that you really want to be looking at improving your process, then you might define as part of the data analysis, well, here's what we've identified as strengths and weaknesses. How are we now going to improve that? So we'll put a process improvement plan in place. So we're currently at level 2. To get to level 3, here's the things that you need to improve and achieve to do that. Okay. And then lastly, you'll create a report. So detailed report that you can send stakeholders to say, here's what we found, here's the data we've gathered, here's the maturity level, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Right, so to identify the maturity level then, so as we've kind of said already, you'll do the analysis, and then from that, you'll be able to identify what the maturity level is. Okay. So apologies, I'm just looking at if there's any questions coming through. Right, so we will, the first thing is we will look at either a single or multiple maturity levels. Okay, so you can complete an assessment to say, have we actually achieved level 2? Yeah, so you might go out and just say, let's just focus on making sure we're at level 2. Yeah, or you might say, actually, we want to look across the whole spectrum and see what level we're at based on every single process area. Okay, again, that's up to you what the scope of that process is. Within that, you then look at each component as an individual thing. Okay, so each component, as we discussed earlier, the maturity levels, the process areas, the specific and generic practices and goals, etc., they're all scored using a 4-tier scale. Okay, so that 4-tier scale is, have we fully achieved this goal or practice? Have we partially achieved it? Have we not achieved it at all, etc.? Yeah, and then based off of that, we will then look at that in sort of conjunction with every other area. Okay, so let me just stop sharing my screen 1 second, and I'll just give you an example here. So just 1 second, I'll share something else with you. Screen again. Okay, so hopefully you can all now see an Excel sheet, fingers crossed, right? So this is what I've used in the past to do very basic kind of assessments at organizations I've been at. Okay, so we've got this scoring key here. Okay, so as I mentioned, we've got these different levels. We've got fully achieved, largely achieved, partially, not, etc. Yeah, and then from there, what we do is for each practice, which we've got here, we will define a score. Okay, so that score will be your fully achieved, etc. And then what you do is then, based on the scores you provided, you achieve an overall consensus. Yeah, so if all of them are fully achieved, great, it's fully achieved. If 2 are fully achieved and 1 is mostly achieved, then you can say, right, well, we'll put that as a fully achieved specific goal. Yeah, so again, you can sort of balance it based on different areas. Okay, then based on all of that, you will then look to generate an overall process area score. Okay, now the process area score can only be based on the weakest area. Okay, so for instance, if you're really good at establishing test policy and really good at test planning, but absolutely rubbish at establishing test performance indicators, then that will bring down the overall process area score. Okay, because you need to improve on that area before you can say you're really good at that particular thing. Okay, so you only ever score the process area and the maturity level based on the weakest area underneath that, if that makes sense. Okay, so again, you need to achieve certain process areas and maturity levels, you need to be good at everything generally. Okay, but again, this is a good way of looking at, well, actually, we're really good at these 2 or 3 things, but really weak on this. So maybe let's look at how we can improve that area more specifically, using the same process we discussed earlier. Okay, the other thing I'll just quickly show you while I've got this open as well, because I was going to show you earlier, is just all of these sub-practices. Okay, so just to kind of go through one of the ones we looked at earlier. So for test environments, we mentioned one of the specific goals is develop test environment requirements. We've got the specific practices here. So those 3 there. So they're the 3 specific practices for that goal. Then next to that, you've then got the sub-practices. Okay, so again, these just help you to identify further what's required to meet that practice. Yeah, so for example, let's pick out one. Let's do this top one, why not? So we've got here elicit test environment needs. Okay, so the sub-practice for that, well, study the test approach and test plan for test environment implications, i.e. what are we testing, how are we testing it, and how will that impact the environment that we're going to need. We'll engage testing representatives for generating those environment needs. So again, who do we need to speak to about this? Have we got a DevOps team or a test environment team that we need to speak to about environments? Have we got stakeholders who need to be involved as well? So we'll identify those key areas that we need to speak to, and we'll go and start having those conversations, etc. Yeah, so again, the model is very detailed in that sense that it does give you a lot of guidance and a lot of information on what you need to do to be good at these particular things. Okay. Right, so if I just now go back, I'll just stop sharing again and I'll go back to the presentation. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so I think we've been through all that on there now, so we'll move on. Okay, finally, I just want to talk about some of the benefits. So a lot of these are pretty obvious, I think, in terms of a rise in productivity. So again, I think if you get people engaged in testing who are testers, and you start to really kind of say to them, right, let's look to improve, let's look to have conversations, let's look to work as hard as we can to be effective, they're going to buy much more into what you're doing and what sort of you're trying to achieve as an organization. So they'll be more productive, and also you'll just be more productive generally because you've got a more effective process. So, you know, the rise in productivity is pretty obvious, but you will get that from those two different angles. Early defect detection. So we mentioned that earlier. If you're looking to do testing earlier, you'll find defects earlier, which makes them cheaper to fix. Overall testing cost reduction, similar point, you know, you're going to find defects earlier, so there'll be, you know, hopefully less testing required. Improved staff morale, which I kind of alluded to a second ago. Greater movement of testers between projects. So again, because you've got upskilled, you know, well-trained testers who are fully engaged, it'll be easier for them to switch between projects because they've got that full understanding of the process, so they'll easily be able to move into another team because they'll know straight away, oh, I know the processes, I know how this works, great. And also I've got that knowledge from training to be able to pick up new skills and new areas quickly. Recognition of testing as a profession within the organization. So again, it's about testing being recognized as that kind of practice that is equal in value to the other practices that you're doing, like development, like support, like BA, because you've got that, again, really effective process, and you've got a very measured and objective way of improving things. And then integration of testing into a dev process. Again, because you're doing testing earlier and you're getting more involved, you're going to start working more closely with the devs. You're going to build up those relationships, and you're going to start to, you know, see good positive results from doing that. Okay, so last slide now, and then I'll answer, well, nearly the last slide. Then I'll answer any questions that you guys have. So I just wanted to go back to that thing I mentioned right at the start in terms of the process issues revisited. Okay, so I mentioned at the start a number of general issues that I encounter, like test data, environment, skill shortages, etc. So I've just listed on there all kind of the process areas or the specific goals that relate to those areas and how you can use TMMi to help you improve those different areas that you might be having trouble with. Okay, so we've done environments already, so if we just pick out another one, you know, if we pick out skill shortages, so, you know, you've got the process area there about test training program, you've got specific goals related to, you know, establishing test training capability, to providing that training, how we're going to do that. So again, you can look at that, get that understanding of what's involved, and look to see if you can help, you know, establish and improve those processes within your organizations. Okay, I've put some further reading on there as well. So, you know, the key one on there is the TMMi website, so it's tmmi.org. If you go on there, there's multiple resources you can look at. There's also details about the certification you can get as well. So there's multiple certifications for TMMi in terms of the TMMi Professional, which basically goes into a lot more detail about the model and how it works, so you can get that understanding and get that qualification. But then it goes more advanced into qualifications around how to actually do assessments, so what's involved and how do you approach those in a professional manner. And then once you are certified, you can then kind of start to do them at a professional kind of, you know, to a professional standard. Okay, so yeah, I definitely recommend, if you're interested in this stuff, look at tmmi.org, have a look at the resources, especially that I mentioned, like the 200-page document with the model on. Again, don't need to read the whole thing, but if you pick out specific areas, then great. It could be, you know, really beneficial to you, you know, to help you identify what's going wrong and how you can improve it. Okay, last one now, promise. So just to take away from this, so, you know, I think if you go away and you consider those process areas that are defined within the TMMi, you can start to look at how these are implemented in your organization. Yes, so how do we, you know, have we implemented our policy and strategy? How have we implemented our training program? How have we implemented our test environment management, etc.? And then you can start to see, based on the TMMi model, how effectively are we doing that? Yeah, and are there things we can look at improving to make it a better process? And you've got those guidelines in place. Yeah, so again, you can use your experience, obviously, but there might be certain things you've not considered, or certain things you've thought, well, I know I need to do that, but how do I go about doing it? Yeah, and TMMi can help with that, because you've got those guidelines, those goals, those practices in place to help you achieve those specific things. Okay, and again, you should be looking to consistently improve your test process, as we mentioned at the start. So, you know, hopefully this can help you do that and help you deliver, you know, success within your businesses. Okay, thanks guys for listening. That's the end now. Thank you. I will go to the questions and answer any questions. All right, so I'll stop sharing my screen. And then,
well done, Danny. Great talk. Thanks for that.
No worries.
I think obviously Phil's put a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you've sort of partially answered that already, but
so for Phil's question, I think, Phil, this relates back to kind of what we discussed at the last QA talk in terms of that kind of test leader. So in Agile, I would expect there to be a test manager or a senior test person who sits outside the Scrum teams, who's looking at this sort of process improvement stuff and strategy from that overall perspective, and is feeding that down then into the Scrum teams. Because for me, Agile teams should be focused purely on delivery. They shouldn't be taking time out to start worrying about processes and practices and that kind of thing. So, there should be that kind of senior person, whether it's a test manager or whatever you want to call them, who is looking at strategy, who is looking at process, who is looking at how can I enable the test teams that we've got within these Agile teams to be better. Yeah. And yes, that will involve quite a bit of input from the Agile teams, but that kind of main point of contact, that main centralized pool, whether it is an individual or a group of people, should be looking at process as an overall thing and should be looking at these types of measures and then working with the Agile teams to say, right, here's how we should be doing testing, how you're doing it currently, how can we make it better, blah, blah, blah. And again, it's got to work for them. So, Agile is a very kind of team-driven process. So you've got to make sure what you're doing is working for the teams that you're delivering to. But again, I wouldn't expect the Agile teams to be doing this outside. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah, answers the question. And to be fair, that's exactly how I would see it as well. Thank you.
Cool, no worries. Great.
Any more questions from anyone? I know there's some more in the group chat.
So we've got Fiona asking a question at the end. Storing all the details on how a central point has proved difficult previously. How do you get around this? So Fiona, I'm happy for you to speak. What do you mean by that?
Sorry, just unmuted myself. So previous places where I've worked, we've used obviously like Confluence or, wiki pages or, shared drives, etc. I think I found that having a lot of people with a lot of input into it means that information gets stored in different places. And so people can almost be duplicating the work somewhere on the way, etc. So how do you get around this? Do you have it stored centrally? Is it all in Word documents somewhere? And obviously they can be quite lengthy. This is aimed at people following processes so they know where to follow it and how to follow it, and also training documentation as well.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that initial point we were talking about in the previous question, in terms of there needs to be that either kind of centralized group of people, whether that's a test center of excellence where, rather than having testing just in the teams, you've got that centralized group of people who are, managing the resources in terms of deployment, who are managing the strategy overall, and then feeding that out to the other teams. So rather than, because I found a lot in certain organizations, every Agile team will do testing completely differently. And that tends to be driven by the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master will be like, oh, I know what good testing looks like. Let's do it like this. And that'll then be driven by them. Bad approach, because you're not getting that consistency. So I would always encourage that sort of policy of having either a test center of excellence or a couple of individuals who are primarily responsible for the process, for driving improvements, and for looking at how do we actually deliver effectively. Yeah. And again, that person should then be collating all the information from the teams into that centralized area, whether it is a Confluence area or whatever. And again, it's got to be distilled to a point where you don't want the teams to be looking through reams and reams of documents. Because not Agile, for one, and two, they're just not going to read it and not going to follow it. So it's getting that balance between, you need to be detailed, you need to be clear, but you need to do it at the level where the teams are actually going to read it and understand it. And I think a lot of that is just sort of that engagement with them, and how do you best work with each individual team and also the teams as a collective, because each team's going to be slightly different and have its own goals and objectives, but you still need that general strategy that everybody should be following, with a couple of minor tweaks here or there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm guessing not every strategy will work for every single team. So you can have integration teams, you can have UAT teams, non-functional teams. they're testing, each area is going to have a different style of
Yep.
testing, and obviously use different tools as well. So, you know, do you separate it completely, or do you try and bring it all together, or do you have different? I mean, I'm more your experience of it rather than, you know.
Yeah, I think my experience of it is that, you know, generally you should be aiming to have, I'd say in the past, I've kind of had a policy for an organization that's right. Here's what, you know, testing looks like within this organization. Here's what I'm trying to achieve, so that, you know, you get everybody bought into this is how generally we do testing and what testing looks like as a organization and a practice. Yeah. And underneath that, you have maybe a couple of slightly more specific strategies for certain types of testing. So we just say you're going to do UAT completely different to how you do, you know, integration testing or whatever, the different practices. Yeah. But they'll have common themes, but they will be slightly different. So again, you might have a certain strategy for each one that has some consistencies, but also slight differences based on the needs and requirements of those teams. And again, a lot of that is challenging, because, you know, it's a lot of effort and it's a lot of collaboration. It's a lot of, you know, sort of information gathering, but it's a very, you know, worthwhile process when you get it right, because you get that consistency where possible, but also that differentiation enough to be able to achieve the specific objectives of each type of testing.
Okay, so just very final one, and I'll shut up. Thing, etc. Does that come under TMI?
Say that again, sorry.
Unit testing?
Yes, yeah, it will do. Yeah.
Okay,
brilliant. In there.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. So, any experiences to share on showing the value of testing at an organization level that are in DevOps journey using TMMi? Not specifically, Hemi. What I would encourage though on that is just taking your whole organization on that journey of understanding what you're doing as a test team. So again, I've been in some organizations where, you know, the testing team are very separate and do their own thing and are very much kind of, you know, not engaged with the rest of the business in the right way. And that just doesn't work. You've got to take them on that journey with you. So, you know, make very clear again, that policy I find is really important, because that gets that buy-in, in terms of, look, this is what we're doing as a you know, test organization. This is what value we're adding to your business. This is the outcomes that we're achieving. And here's some very clear kind of, you know, key performance indicators to how we're going to work with you and how we're going to be successful and how we're going to drive, you know, quality into the whole process. And once you've got that, that's a very simple document that you can then spread out to the rest of the teams, and then you can feed down from there in terms of building out those kind of, you know, walkthroughs, those workshops where you can say, this is how we are doing testing. This is why it's an effective process, and this is why you should be continuing to, you know, invest in it, and, you know, looking at generally innovating things like automation and that sort of thing. So I'd always start at that highest level with keep it simple test policy that, you know, is easily digestible for the business. And then once you've got that initial buy-in, then you can start going into the more detail and start talking about TMMi in terms of, you know, we're a very effective and professional test service because we're following this model, we're aiming to be objective, and we're looking to improve, you know, based on these very clear criteria that are defined as an actual, you know, professional model. Make sense? Cool. I like that. I like the video touch. Cool. Is TMMi level for the organization or the team department level? Organization, I'd say, in answer to Dunk's question there. So I'd say it's across the whole organization. So yes, again, you'll look to split it down into teams and departments and have those conversations and discussions. And there might be certain times when you have to make certain changes. So again, if you consider what I was talking about earlier in terms of the process areas and how you measure them, there might be some of those that maybe aren't relevant for certain teams or certain areas. And again, you can just discount those. That's fine. That's not an issue to the model, because if you discount it, you just don't then count it towards the effectiveness of that process for that team. So, you know, yes, it's the whole organization, but you can make it a bit more general and a bit more specific for certain teams and departments as well as required. Does that answer your question?
Okay, great. I think that pretty much rounds it off. Unless anyone has any final questions, feel free to speak up. Oh, there we go. I think Shailesh has just asked one, so if you could have one more.
Cool. Time for one more. If it's in process framework guideline systems. Okay, very good question. So my answer to this would be, and again, I'm feeling like a politician here. I'm just like dodging questions a little bit, but I'd say here, like my view is that, I very much like processes. I'm a massive process geek. I'm a tester at heart in terms of huge process geek. So I'm very much driven by process, and I think that's a really important thing that needs to be in place. However, I understand the fact that, you know, individuals are very much kind of creatures of habit and creatures of, I've done it this way before, I think this might work best for me, or work best in this, you know, particular team or type of testing we're doing, or whatever. So I always think that the main thing that needs to be in place is the fact that the process have to be there. Yeah, but that doesn't mean to say that that's exactly how we have to do it in every single instance. So I think it just drives conversation and drives kind of, what's the phrase I'm looking for here? Drives sort of, yeah, I think just drives those conversations in teams as to, right, here's the process we've got. Yes, we need to follow that as closely as we can, but are there any perhaps differences, or are there any particular challenges or needs we have within our team that might come outside that? And then again, we can have those conversations and discussions to agree to that. But without that process in place, it's just going to become anarchy over time, because you're just going to have each team doing its own thing and thinking it knows best and all of that. But if there's that general governance and guidance in place to say, here's what we should be aiming towards, let's have a discussion about if there's any changes, great, we can adapt that as required. So I think, you know, you've got to have the process in place to, you know, have that end goal to be aiming towards. But if that needs to shift in any way based on people's experience or the needs or whatever, I think that's okay as well, as long as it's not like, you know, going on a completely different path. Cool.
There we go. Great. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Danny. That was really insightful, really helpful. I'm sure everyone will agree. Obviously, you know, in future, if anyone has any subjects that they'd like to see covered, or a subject that you'd like to cover yourself, feel free to drop me a message. I'd be more than happy to sort of facilitate that. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It'd be great to see you all again next week. As I said, Dunks is doing a talk on self-development, which is really relevant for lots of people like right now who find themselves sort of in between contracts, in between jobs, or just out of work for whatever reason. So really relevant talk. I know lots of people, you know, have had interest from that for lots of contractors actually who are out of contract. So should have some good numbers for that. And yeah, I hope to see you all next week. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really
Thank you very much.
No, cheers, Danny.
Cheers all. Bye-bye.
Thanks for that. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye.
Thank you.